All right, we'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's Profit webinar, Making Money While Reaching Your Goals. This webinar is part of our Profit Risk Management series that includes webinars and in-person workshops focused on a variety of topics including food safety regulations, GAP certification, crop insurance, business planning, and risk management tools. If you look at the handout section of your control panel, you'll see a flyer that contains all the information you'll need to join any of the remaining trainings in this series. You'll also find the slideshows being presented today that you can download and keep for later reference. I also invite you to visit our website at indigenousfoodandag.com, where you'll find more information about the Profit series, downloadable copies of the presentations given to date, and links to videos of all past Profit webinars. All attendees will be muted during the presentations, but once today's presenters have completed their slideshows, I'll unmute attendees that have any questions. Attendees should use the control panel to raise their hands, or you can submit questions using the questions dialog box. After the Profit presentation, there will be a presentation about the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative's Model Food Code project presented by the Assistant Director, Aaron Parker. We'll have an additional question and answer session after that presentation. At the end of the webinar software will prompt you to fill out an evaluation for today's presentation. If you could take a moment to fill that out, we would appreciate it. This series is possible with support from the USDA Risk Management Agency and the University of Arkansas School of Law Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative, who have joined with the Farm Credit Council and Morse Marketing to offer this important series of workshops. I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Gary Madison from the Farm Credit Council. Gary works for the Farm Credit Systems Trade Association in Washington, D.C. as Vice President for the Young Beginning Small Farmer Programs and Outreach. This includes policy work on local foods, sustainable agriculture, and direct-to-consumer agriculture. Until recently, Gary was a small farmer raising greenhouse wholesale cut flowers marketed in the Northeast and beef cattle for local sales. I'd like to welcome Gary, and Gary, the presentation is now yours.
Thanks, Brian. I appreciate being able to be with you and the rest of you on the webinar today. And I'm going to assume that all of you on the webinar are pretty good problem solvers. What I'm going to try to do today is to make the case to you that being a problem solver in your own farm business means having plans, goals, and keeping records. I think we all have a picture in our heads that running, we'll stay on the previous slide there, Brian. I think we all have a picture in our heads that running a successful farm business means walking around and paying attention, and that enables you to be a capable manager of your farm operation. But real success comes from anticipating the future, planning how to deal with problems ahead of time, and measuring if you've accomplished the things you've planned to do. Now that next slide. We all have some idea of what success on our farm or ranch operation is going to look like. I'm going to make the case that by setting expectations for your business, which includes, most importantly, setting expectations for yourself, you're going to have a much higher chance of achieving success. Next slide. It's pretty simple. If you want to reach your goals of running a farm business, you have to plan to make money. If you don't make money, you can't keep doing what you want to do. If you're thinking that you want to have a small business and not make a lot of money, that's fine, but you still have to have a plan for making some amount of money. Making money from your farm business allows you to have choices. If you fail to make money, there's a limit as to how long you can keep losing money. Even if someone gives you a whole pile of money to do whatever you want, you still have to have some sort of plan to spend it and a plan to earn money by selling something. There are really only two choices: planning to make money or losing money. Next slide. Now, planning to make money requires a few steps, answering some basic questions in an organized way and writing it down. And the first basic question is, what do you expect to go right? And by that I mean, how do you know if you're going to succeed? How do you define success? Most people don't go into business in order to lose money. But not knowing how much you expect to make is likely going to result in losing money. Every business needs to have a definition of success. Writing down specific, measurable accomplishments is how a business defines that success. Okay, the flip side of figuring out what you want to go right is thinking ahead about what you expect to go wrong. What kind of problems are you going to plan for? What is it that will keep you awake at night? And what preparations can you make ahead of time for the things that you know might happen? I was in the greenhouse business for 30 years, and I needed to have electricity to keep my greenhouses warm in the winter and cool in the summer. Without electricity, my greenhouse crop would freeze in about 30 minutes when it was very cold outside, or cook in about 45 minutes if it was really hot outside. Either way, I'd be out of business if I didn't have electricity, so I had a backup generator. And I actually had a backup to the backup generator, and in case that one didn't work, I had a third generator. The more I invested in planning for and preparing for something I knew was going to happen, like the electricity going out, the more relaxed I was about being able to cope with whatever that problem is. So planning ahead for the bad things that might happen isn't just about like planning for that lack of electricity, the electricity going off. It's also about, so it's not just about producing the crop or the cattle or the apples or the vegetables or whatever you're producing, but planning for bad things to happen is also about selling it. Do you have backup plans for marketing whatever it is that you grow? Next slide. I think a less obvious part of planning for farm business success is being able to communicate with others. Who do you actually have to convince that this whole business plan of yours is a good idea? And how are you going to write down your good ideas? That person that you have to convince may be your spouse or partner or business partner, maybe mom and dad who you're going to borrow money from, maybe a lender. But really, most of all, you need to be able to assure yourself that you have a good business plan that will make money. And so that really the answer, the first answer of who do you have to convince this is a good idea is that person looking back at you in the mirror. If you can't be sure that you have planned adequately for your business success, you're going to have a hard time sleeping at night once you start spending a lot of money and investing and buying cattle or buying land or building greenhouses, whatever your business is. You need to have assured yourself first that you actually have a plan for how to be successful. Next slide, please. Now, you don't have to, well, thinking about what your business is going to be like, I don't know, how many cattle you're going to get, where to graze them, how you're going to sell them, all those things are in your head, but how do you write that all down? And that's what a business plan does. It allows you to write things down so you can remember all the details and be able to hand that business plan to somebody else to read so that they can understand what you are planning to do to be successful. The more complicated your business is, or the more unusual it is, the more plan you're going to need. If you're going to be doing something that is fairly typical in your area, let's say you're you're going to raise cattle, like in this picture, fatten them on grass, and sell most of them off in the fall, you probably need less of a plan than if you were planning on having a very complex multi-state vegetable growing operation or something that's very complicated. Next slide, please, Brian. But you do have to understand that you don't have to borrow money to be successful. Borrowing money should be thought of as borrowing a tool. Now, you wouldn't go borrow a tractor from your neighbor unless you knew you needed a tractor, what you were going to do with it that is productive, and how long you need the tractor for. So if you're going to borrow money, you need to be able to tell your lender about why you need that tractor. You also need to be able to say how you're going to use the tractor, and how you're going to pay for it. It sounds like a whole lot of writing, which I understand is probably not on the top of your list of how much fun you're going to have operating your own farm business. So let me simplify it a bit. Next slide. A business plan is divided into two parts, the words and the numbers. I'm going to make the case to you that what's most important is the budget. It's the numbers. And I realize that most farmers don't go into farming or ranching because they really like numbers. They go into it because they want to produce something. They're not necessarily financial experts, and you shouldn't have to be. But you do need to understand, as a small business person, you do need to understand how you're going to earn that money and how much you're going to have in your checking account, your cash flow, at any given time over the year, so that you know that you're going to be able to not just pay your bills for the business, but be able to, do things like put gas in the tank of your truck, feed the kids, do the other things that you're going to need to do. So what I'm going to emphasize with you is this: even though I've divided what should be in a business plan into these two parts, the words and the numbers, and knowing that you're probably not going into business because you really like numbers, I'm still going to tell you the most important part of your business plan is the numbers, because if you are confident in the numbers, then you can be very confident in the description that you're going to be able to give to a business partner, to a spouse, to a lender, about what you're going to do and why you're going to do it and how you're going to do it. All those explanations that are the written words are going to be a lot easier if you are very confident of the numbers that you have. Let's take a look at the next slide. These are my 4 biggest pieces of advice for a new farmer. Yeah, I realize that it's the same thing 4 times, but that's how important I think it is. If you understand a budget for a whole year, that you have laid out a monthly cash flow budget for a whole year, in other words, what you're going to spend money on and how you're going to make income, and you have that planned out for a whole year, you are really going to understand how it is that you expect your business to make money. If you only think in annual terms, like, I'm going to sell $100,000 worth of cattle this year, and I think I'll make maybe $15,000 if I do that, that's a plan for a business to fail. Even though you know how to manage cattle, you've worked for somebody else, you grew up in the cattle business, let's say, you know what you're doing, you know who you're going to sell them to, you got a real sweetheart deal for transportation, everything is in place. If you don't know and have a plan for what cash is going to flow into your business and out of your business every month, you're probably going to fail. Cash flow is the #1 cause of failure in a small business. And planning for cash flow, I have to admit, it's not the most exciting thing that you can do for your business. But without it, you have a very high chance of failing in business. Let's look at the next slide. So this is a monthly cash flow budget. It fits on 1 page for a small-scale vegetable business. We'll stay on this slide for a minute, Brian, but on the next slide, I'll give you the address that you can go to download this as a live spreadsheet. So this one's a small-scale vegetable business, also available as a grass-fed beef business and a pastured pork business on the same website. Okay, I realize that looking at a spreadsheet like this is scary, especially if you're not a numbers person. And while there may be some merit in the risk mitigation aspect of diversifying and doing different businesses, having a couple different ways of making money, there's also a lot to be said for focusing on what you're good at and building on the strength that you have. And to do that effectively means business planning with a monthly cash flow budget like this. Let's go to the next slide, Brian. This is the address. There you go. This is the address at which you can download that spreadsheet that I just showed you for a small-scale vegetable business, as well as a separate spreadsheet for the grass-fed beef and a separate one for pastured pork. The reason why I've made these spreadsheets available is that, you know, I realize that doing spreadsheets is not all that much fun for a lot of people, and you'd really rather be doing something else with the time that you spend thinking about planning for your business. What I'd encourage you to do is download any of those 3 spreadsheets, depending on which is closest to the kind of farm business operation that you're planning, and start to plug in some of your own numbers. It's a live spreadsheet. You can play with it. You can download a copy, save a clean copy, put in your own numbers. You know, if you're doing the grass-fed beef one, they're going to be different feed costs in your area probably than what's in the budget. Asking yourself all of those questions. What am I going to spend on veterinary costs? What am I going to spend on if you're on feed costs? What's your land rental cost? By looking at a spreadsheet that somebody has already done, you're going to be able to see a whole bunch of questions that you should ask yourself about the costs, what it's going to cost you to produce that beef, and also about the income. And then most importantly, because the budget reflects an entire year of operation, you're going to see when to expect money going out, spending money, expenses, and when to see money coming in when you sell animals and or produce a crop and you turn that into some cash. And again, planning for cash flow is the most important thing you can do before you go into business, to know that you're going to have enough cash to produce the crop, to meet your expenses before you get any income from that crop. Next slide, please. So as far as financial tools, I've already said that monthly cash flow budget is way at the top of my list. And from the perspective of being that actual producer, the farm business owner, I think that's the most important thing for you to be able to convince yourself you're doing the right thing by going into business for yourself. Even if you're talking about 10 head of cattle or a quarter of an acre of vegetable production, it's important to develop a budget ahead of time so that you have clear expectations for what you want to have happen. In a particular month, you're going to have a certain number of expenses. You're going to buy seeds. You're going to buy fertilizer. In a different month, you're going to sell some of that crop. Knowing what you expect to have happen is a way for you to look ahead into the future and say, okay, I remember now, you know, in June, I'm going to start going to farmers markets, let's say, to sell vegetables, because in my budget, I have a certain number of sales of vegetables at farmers markets. So I got to do all of the things that are going to allow me to be at a farmers market. I have to register to be there. I have to find a vehicle to drive there. I have to have some baskets or containers for the vegetables. I have to figure out what the prices are. When you do a plan on a budget so that you have some numbers, that's not your entire plan of how things are going to happen. But if you look at those numbers and say, you know, I'm going to sell stuff at a farmer's market, that should generate all those questions in your head about, so how are you going to do that? What do you need to make that happen? And so that budget in numbers is really the basis of understanding what you're going to do next, what you expect. The capital expense budget, that's a fancy way of saying what equipment do you want to buy? What things do you want to buy for your business that are going to help you be more efficient? Do you need a new tractor? Do you need a rototiller? Do you need fencing? By setting out ahead of time what you want to invest in, what you want to buy, you can prioritize that list so that you're not buying things just because you have a bunch of cash in your pocket. You know, if you're starting out in the cattle business and you've gone through your first I don't know, 3/4 of a year, you've raised some steers, you've sold them, you've got a bunch of money in your pocket, you probably shouldn't go out and buy a brand new pickup truck. If you have a capital expense budget, you can consider everything that you may want to buy, like the fencing or the truck or a creep feeder or whatever that other piece of equipment might be, and you can prioritize and you can decide what it is that you want to buy and make sure you have the money available to buy it. Numbers 3 and 4 on this slide, the income statement and the balance sheet, are pretty standard financial statements. They're probably more important to a lender than they are to the farmer. The balance sheet is important to a lender because a lender wants to know what you have, what assets you have, what money do you have, what things do you have that are worth something like a truck or cattle or land or a bank account, in order to be able to decide whether or not to lend you money. Lenders, of course, are not going to lend you money if you don't have some money to put into the business yourself. Next slide, please, Brian. The other part of writing a plan for business is mitigating risk. You know, I told you my story about mitigating risk in the greenhouse business by having a backup generator and then a backup for the backup. Well, let's look at the photo here. If you're in the direct-to-retail sort of vegetable growing business and you're planning on selling at farmers markets, and it rains every day that you are, every Saturday when you're supposed to be at your best market on a Saturday market, what are you going to do? How are you going to sell those vegetables? Do you have another outlet? Do you have another plan for how you're going to sell those vegetables? Or are you just going to give up because, gosh, it rained every Saturday during the month of June and July, and people just didn't come to the farmers market? And I know for some of you, rain every weekend in June and July sounds like a godsend. Right now, it's a pretty big drought up in my home state of New Hampshire. The next slide, please, Brian. So risk mitigation is all about planning for what could go wrong. And as you answer those questions, what are the biggest risks? Again, for me, it was no electricity. You know, the oil burner's not working in the winter, the fan's not working in the summer, so I had spare electric motors for my fans. Being able to know how much risk you're willing to face is a really good gut check on your business plan and how you handle the prospect or the possibility of losing something. Most people don't like to lose something. That's, you know, most of us don't make bets on horses or on cards or whatever. We make, I guess we're farmers, we make bets on our ability to produce and sell a crop. But if you have a budget, if you have that monthly cash flow budget, and then you think about what can go wrong, you can do a pretty good job of understanding the limits to your risk, understanding how much overall risk you're really going to face in the course of producing and selling that crop. And that last bullet, the mind hack of preparation, if you're actually planning for something bad to happen, like the electricity going out, in my case, when it does happen, you really feel prepared. You have mentally prepared yourself for the fact that, you know, something bad is going to happen. I think it might be the electricity going out, and darn it, I'm really ready for that to happen. I know what to do. The longer you're in business and the more you plan, or the more you plan ahead, the more you're going to anticipate all of those things that could go wrong. And when the time comes for something bad that has happened to you, you're going to be able to face that with a much greater degree of success because you've already thought about it. That's the mind hack of preparation, is you get good at anticipating problems, and when something bad happens, you're ready for it, you know how to deal with it. Next slide, please. All of you know how to make things work. You can take parts and pieces and you can put them together, whether it's literal parts like these equipment parts on the slide, or whether it's putting people together and building a team that's going to be able to grow and sell vegetables. You're good at that because you're planning on being a business, and that's one of those things that is gratifying about being in business, is that you know how to make things work. Understanding or preparing for how things don't work, next slide there, is something that we're less likely to do. You know, people like to think about success a lot more than they like to think about failure. But anticipating what could go wrong and doing it in an organized way is extremely important in assuring some business success. If you look at this slide that's on the that's up now, you'll see across the top are the 5 key areas of risk management. Things related to people. Who do you hire? Things related to financial. What are your financial goals and expectations? How are you going to earn money? Production risk, as in, oh gosh, should I buy irrigation or not? What sort of things can I do to mitigate the risk of drought that might be incorporating more organic matter into my soil ahead of time? That marketing risk, like I mentioned, as far as selling at a farmer's market and having lots of rainy days. What are your alternate plans? And then finally, legal risk, which is really more about buying the right insurance. You know, if you're selling at retail, you need some kind of trip and fall insurance, or if you have a truck on the road, you certainly need some insurance for that vehicle. Now, on the left-hand side of the form is the 5-step process of identifying, prioritizing, evaluating, selecting the solution or strategy to mitigate the risk, and then review. Review is one of those things that people, you know, tend to leave off their list. I put it on here because I think it's important to assess the kinds of risk mitigation that you have used in order to determine if you should do more of it. I mentioned I had a backup generator for my greenhouse, and then I had a backup generator in case that one didn't work. Electricity is really, really important. More than once, my primary generator did not start for some reason, so I was really glad I had the backup generator, the second backup generator. That was a good strategy, as it turned out. Another way to assess risk that's maybe a little more complicated or review this, an effective strategy would be something like crop insurance. Crop insurance is certainly the kind of product that fits into a production or a financial risk in this form. Considering if you're a vegetable grower, if you should buy whole farm revenue protection crop insurance, is that the right financial decision for you to do? Of course, that's beyond the scope of this webinar, but it's a risk that you can identify, and there's a very specific insurance product that would allow you perhaps to make a really good choice as to whether to insure your farm business with whole farm revenue insurance, or if you're growing corn and soybeans with a more standard sort of crop insurance. Either way, knowing that that there's insurance available, there may be insurance available for the crop you want to grow, and finding out how much it costs and what sort of benefit it would provide you is an important part of assessing risk in a plan. And of course, you know, I'm showing you a one-page risk management plan. That's kind of just to make sure everything fits on one page so you can see the process. It may take you a lot longer or a lot more paper than just one page to have a real accurate assessment of all of the risks that you face. Next slide, please, Brian. The important thing is but you're going to try to assess those risks before they actually bite you in the butt, before the bad thing happens. And again, this is along the lines of, if you prepare for risk and if you think of the risk, you're going to be better prepared to handle it ahead of time. So what I'm encouraging you is to, as part of your business planning exercise, to write down what could go wrong and how you're going to handle that risk. As a for instance, if you are in the vegetable growing business, a good risk management strategy may be buying an irrigation system. That's an example of a risk management tool, irrigation, that may actually earn you money, because you're going to have a better crop that's more productive. You may even get more tonnage of whatever vegetables you're growing because you have irrigation. So it's not just a risk management strategy for lack of rain, it's also some way to enhance your production. And like anything, if you don't pay attention to the risks that you're facing, if you say, well, you know, I really don't want to turn on the irrigation this week because it doesn't look all that dry, you know, your risk management plan, the things you put in place, aren't necessarily very effective. All of risk management depends on being responsive. It depends on having a plan of what to do and then actually doing it. You know, I could have 10 backup generators for my greenhouse, but if I didn't actually make sure one was running and making electricity, then all of my planning for having lots of generators would be for nothing, because you have to be able to respond and make your risk mitigation strategy happen and implement it and do the thing that is going to save your crop or provide you with an alternate marketplace. Okay, next slide. We'll just change strategies here a little bit. A couple of things to pass on to you. You know, I don't want to sound like a downer here, but there are some common mistakes for farm businesses, or any business, but farm businesses in particular, that I've seen with young and beginning farmers. I think I've already talked a lot about cash flow and just plain not planning for it, somehow believing that money will fall from heaven somehow. I don't know what people do. You need to have a real definite plan, a monthly cash flow spreadsheet that shows cash in, cash out. But another common mistake is overinvestment in land. Many beginning farmers think that they need to own the land in order to be a farmer. I think the most successful beginning farmers that I have met, particularly those in a land-intensive business like grass-fed beef or raising cattle, the most successful ones are the ones who avoid buying land, at least when they're young, when they're starting out, and concentrate on getting really good at doing the thing that makes them money, which is taking pounds of feed or pounds of grass and turning it into pounds of beef. You don't really need to buy the farm in order to be a farmer. You need to control access to land or some productive resource. And I just caution you, and this may sound funny coming from a lender who lends money to buy land, but that cash flow budget is a really good way to help you plan whether you should be buying land, just like it's a good way to plan what capital expenses, like a tractor or fencing or other equipment, you should buy. Over-investing, I've said here over-investing in land, but it could be, I should have said land and equipment. Probably the most common mistake of beginning farmers is not to keep good records. If you don't know how you have performed in your business, if you don't know that you have met the expectations you set for yourself in that monthly cash flow budget that you've laid out for your year in farming, you're not going to know how you made money. You're not going to know which things you did were the most effective at making you money and which things lost you money. keeping records has become much more important, particularly for things like whole farm revenue insurance, where you need at least 3 years of records to be able to have get that insurance at a reasonable rate. Being able to demonstrate, even if you start with an overgrown 4-H project or FFA project in high school, but you have records for several years of what you've produced, how much you made, what your cost of inputs, your expenses were. That kind of evidence that you have kept records is extremely important to a lender. It's extremely important to a business partner to be able to demonstrate the skill that you know how to write down what has happened. How much did you get for beans last year? How much did you sell your yellow squash for? What was the price per pound you got at the auction for your cattle? All of those kinds of pieces of business information written down in a way that someone else can understand, which, by the way, is a monthly cash flow budget, is extremely important for convincing a lender or a potential business partner that you know what you're doing. Next slide, please. Okay, so if there are common mistakes, there are also some pretty common solutions, which I've really already talked about. Did I mention monthly cash flow budgeting was important? I think I said that a few times. Having the risks written down as part of your business plan. Do you have to write a whole paragraph? Oh, probably not. Write bullet points. Risk. Electricity goes out and cooks the flowers in the greenhouse. Solution. Get a generator. It doesn't have to be complicated, but to be able to show that you have written down and thought through what's going to happen for the success of your business and what are potential problems with achieving that success is extremely important to convince somebody else, spouse, partner, lender, that you know what you're doing, that you are a capable person who is going to be able to handle the responsibility of being a business. And for those of you who may be, you may have grown up on a farm, you're working with mom or dad or uncle or some other relative now, and you have that nagging feeling that they don't really respect your opinion, they don't really trust you, they never let you make hard decisions. Well, some of that, if you think about it from their perspective, some of that is you've never shown them that you've really thought through what it is that you want to do, what your solution is. If you were to say let's say you're in a cattle operation now with mom and dad, and you bring them a monthly cash flow budget for taking 20 head and raising them slightly differently in a grass-fed beef environment and seeking a different market at a much higher premium price for those animals, and here's what additional time it will take you to manage that business, and here's the additional resources you'll need, the extra pasture, and here's the extra income that you'll get. All of those kinds of common solutions, a monthly cash flow budget, a risk management plan, writing down what you expect, all of those things will help you convince the older generation that you are capable of being a manager. It's not some mystery. You've actually written it down, and you can show it to them. You can talk about it. You can say, hey, I've got this idea. What do you think about it? And that's part of what I've been trying to say about who do you have to convince with your business plan, if it's a good thing or not. Sometimes that's within your own family in order to gain the respect and the trust of the older generation in the farm business that you may be trying to grow into and take over. Next slide, please. So to wrap up, I want to ask you all to ask yourselves that question. Are you going to be the laid back, take whatever happens sort of farm business manager, just kind of watching stuff? Are you going to be, next slide, please. you going to be a superstar, meeting the expectations and goals that you've set for yourself so that you can chart your own course in life? And to be that superstar, particularly a financial superstar, I think the best way to be that person, to be that successful farm business operator, is to plan to make money. Brian, that's all I had. If there's some questions now, we can do that. If you want me to wait till later, I'm happy to do so.
All right, thank you, Gary. I'd invite any of our attendees, if you would like to ask a question, use your control panel to raise your hand, or you can type a question into the questions box. All right, seeing no questions, then Gary, thank you for your presentation. We'll move on to our Model Food Code project presentation that Aaron's going to be giving. I just want to remind everyone that after Aaron's presentation, we'll also have a Q&A session about the Model Food Code project. So I'll go ahead and introduce Aaron. She's the Assistant Director of the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative, where she supports the initiative through program development, research and writing, and analysis of legislative and regulatory issues affecting tribal governments, businesses, and individual producers. The bulk of her professional work centers on the tension between food and agricultural law and federal Indian law. She recently authored the 2015 Intertribal Food Systems Report, which lifts up nearly 100 different innovative food systems programs doing work across Indian country. Before joining the initiative, Aaron worked as a staff attorney and research coordinator for the Cabell Commission, a national working group convened by the Secretary of the Interior to repair the federal government's Indian Land Trust Management System. She holds both her JD and her LLM in agricultural and food law from the University of Arkansas, and her final thesis for the LLM program was a practical legal guide to conducting food recovery in the state of Arkansas. She continues to advance her work in the area of food conservation law and policy by volunteering her time and experience to the law school's Food Recovery Project. And with that, I will pause Gary's presentation. And load up our new one here. There we go. And Aaron, it's all yours.
All right, that looks like me. Thank you very much, Brian. And thanks to everyone on the webinar for joining us this afternoon. And if you're listening to this later after we've recorded it and posted it on our website, thank you in the future for joining us too. I'm very excited to be with you today to talk just a little bit about one of our projects at the initiative, one of the biggest things I think we're working on right now, the Model Tribal Food and Agriculture Code project, which is a mouthful. We've embarked on this 3-year journey to write an entire legal code that tribal governments can then adopt either in whole or in part, really as the fullest expression of their sovereignty in the space of food and agriculture. So during this presentation, I'm going to be explaining the project a little bit more. I'll be talking about how tribal governments' adoption of food and agriculture code laws for the tribe can secure the health of tribal citizens, promote more vibrant tribal economies, and increase food security. So let's get started. We start, of course, with food sovereignty. This is a guiding principle for us as we're writing the code. We want any section in this entire vast code that we're writing, any particular model law that we write, we always want it to be grounded and written with these goals in mind, these particular goals. This is a food sovereignty definition that came out of an international convening of people back in 1996 via Campesina. And it's a really long definition in paragraph form, but we've broken it down a little bit here just so you can kind of see the different elements that really go into a thoughtful principled approach to food sovereignty. So first of all, of course, it focuses on food for people, and that food is further broken down into food that's sufficient so that everyone has food, food that's healthy, that nourishes our bodies, and food that's culturally appropriate. So really putting traditional foods and traditional seeds right there in the center of food policy for all people, and here in our work, especially for tribes. Food sovereignty also values the food providers, the farmers, ranchers, fishermen who are actually out there growing the food, or in some cases gathering the food, making sure that those folks are protected, that they're able to do their work, and that they're able to get that food to the people who need it, whether that means selling it or for feasts, whatever that means, protecting those folks. And I want to pause here. I'm going to say this a couple of times, I think, during my presentation, but we've been going around the country talking to folks, native farmers and ranchers, tribal food businesses, tribal governments, and the like, about this project for about a year now. And one of the things that we've heard over and over again is that producers don't want to be overregulated. And we know that. We knew that before we started the project, and we definitely are remembering that as we go along. So I just wanted to lift up that we are definitely thinking about valuing food producers and not over-regulating them. We know no farmer anywhere wants more regulations. We want to make sure that tribal businesses are supported and able to thrive, and tribal food systems are supported and able to thrive. And as lawyers, we're looking at that through a legal lens and really giving effect to food sovereignty through that lens. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit before I went any further. And the third thing on food sovereignty is localizing food systems and really thinking about food systems in a very local way. One of our colleagues on the project, Ade Romero Briones, she likes to say that the tribal food systems really embody all of the connections in a tribe. They're very holistic. They think about the cultural health of the tribe, the spiritual health of the tribe, as well as the physical health of the people, the tribal citizens, and the health of the actual food system itself, and tribal government. All of that is kind of part and parcel of a tribal food system. And thinking about that and making sure that it's protected and helping producers thrive and helping tribal citizens thrive is part of food sovereignty as well. And we're definitely thinking about that as we're writing this model laws. Food sovereignty also puts control locally, and you'll see this is bolded here because this is a really huge piece of our focus as we think about laws that can really help secure the health of tribal peoples and the health of tribal food systems. Making sure that that control is in the hands of tribal governments, that tribal governments know what's actually going to work best for their people, not regulators who are coming from the outside looking in, but people who are actually part of the culture, who know everything that there is to know about the tribal food system, that those are the folks who are making sure that these rights are protected and then established in laws. Building knowledge and skills, obviously also very important. We work a lot with beginning farmers and ranchers around here. We have a big summer program for Native youth who want to go into food systems careers, so we see about 100 Native youth from all over the country, including Alaska and Hawaii, every year, and we work with them on building that knowledge and skills, that skill set, so that the next generation of Native farmers and ranchers is ready to take over and really help food systems continue to thrive in Indian country. So that's another piece of food sovereignty, is that looking forward into the future, preparing future generations to understand the cultural knowledge, but also the legal framework that helps tribal food systems continue to grow and support their people. The final piece of the food sovereignty definition that we're kind of working with here is this working with nature. Obviously, that's a huge piece as well, making sure that we're thinking through solutions to climate change, but doing that in a way that makes sense to a local ecosystem. And again, that word local comes back, just making sure that the control of a food system is in the hands of the people who are actually participating in the food system, recognizing that the tribes actually know best how to manage their own lands through traditional ecological knowledge and other practices that they've had since time immemorial, and actually putting those into the law to make sure that those food systems are still protected. So that's kind of what we're looking at when we look at food sovereignty. In terms of food and agriculture law and policy, obviously, I think the easy question for anybody listening to me talk right now is how in the world do we use the law to give actual effect to all of the many principles that I just outlined in that lengthy food sovereignty definition? And I think part of the answer is that we can actually look at a huge body of law that already exists to see how food and agriculture policies are already given effect through the law. These are just a few examples. I could probably be here all day talking about food and ag law because I'm a food and ag lawyer and we just like to talk. But these are kind of a condensed version. We can start with international law since that obviously overlays the framework for all of these other things. There are so many conventions and treaties and agreements in the realm of food. And when we think about the rights of, there's a right to food actually in United Nations conventions. There are international food safety conventions that operate. There are so many different international treaties. If you look at the European Union, they have a huge law that protects the way that people market food. So if you've ever looked at Parmesan cheese and the way that it's labeled, like some of that is actually covered by international laws. So laws are out there and they're all over the place regulating food and agriculture all of the time, and that's true at an international level and at a federal level. I think the thing that most people are familiar with is the farm bills, so we went ahead and lifted those up here, and those have been coming out since 1933. That's kind of the big, huge piece of ag and nutrition policy that happens here at a federal level. We also had another law recently passed in 2010, the Food Safety and Modernization Act, and I'm going to be talking about that a lot today because it kind of spurred us on into doing this project. The Food Safety and Modernization Act is the most sweeping piece of food safety legislation that we've seen in this country in about 30 years. It's really focusing on giving FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, the authority to regulate food safety in a way that they haven't really been able to do in the past 30 years. It's pushing food safety regulation, I think, closer and closer onto the farm. And so part of what we've seen with the Food Safety Modernization Act in particular is that federal regulations and also state and local regulations are really pushing closer and closer onto the farm, and that is true for tribal producers as well as any other producer out there. But for tribes, obviously, a tribal government has the ability to occupy the space of tribal jurisdiction and have its own laws for its own tribal producers on its own lands. So that's part of all of this. I also want to point out, just as we're thinking about laws in general, that regulation in this area isn't really new. Food and ag law has been around for a long time. We often think of laws, I think, as things that may be written, and certainly all of the things that are on this slide are, but they can also be verbal. They can be passed down through generations as customs, and tribes aren't at all strangers to that kind of regulation either. When our director, Janie Hook, gives this presentation, she talks a lot about her own tribe, the Chickasaw Nation, and she's actually gone back through really, really old Chickasaw code back through the 1800s and found old food and ag laws that have been on their books since then, and those are just the written ones. So there's definitely precedent for tribes occupying this space, but when it comes to some of the newer regulations, especially around food safety, a lot of tribal codes are really silent on these particular matters. And in the absence of an actual tribal law, what we're concerned about is that this increasing federal regulation is going to kind of step in. And so what we wanted to do with the code project is offer up to tribes the ability to just take what we've written, make it the most relevant to their particular situation, and then pass that so that they are occupying that legal space. And so they're able to kind of shape the way that their own food system is regulated and in a thoughtful way that actually makes sense with their traditions. And that's really the role of tribal governments in this space, which is already very critical, right? And it's only going to continue to be more critical in the future as regulations around food continue to tighten, as they become more and more about the actual on-farm production processes. And it's usually at this point when I'm doing this in person that I hold up my smartphone, because I think one of the reasons that we're starting to be able to see this increased regulation going closer and closer onto the farm is really it's really a reflection of the technology and the times I think that we live in. We are able to track the way that food moves in a very efficient way that is really unprecedented in the history of food production. And I don't think that, given the advent of smartphone technology and all of the other interesting things that we have going for us, that we're going to put that regulatory cat back in the bag. I think now with the Food Safety Modernization Act, this is a new legal reality that we live in, and making sure that tribal governments are ready for that and prepared for that, preparing their producers for that is really part of what we're doing with this project. So these are just some of the things that tribal governments do, right? This isn't just about food and that's sold, by the way. I also want to point that out. Food sovereignty is obviously about more than just food that's sold. I'm going to be talking a lot about business because we're kind of in the making money space today. But I don't want to paint a picture of food sovereignty as just being about food that's produced and then sold to folks. Obviously, it's about, again, that local control and tribes enacting policies for themselves. And that means food that's produced to be sold, but it's also traditional seeds, foods that are unique, cultural things that need to be protected. And that's why you'll see here establishing and defending protection for those unique cultural foods and seeds. That's a thing that a tribal government can do that an individual person who's a member of that tribe can't do. Actually having a policy on the books that is crafted in a way that protects seeds, that keeps them safe, that keeps traditional foods safe, that thinks thoroughly about the overall policy of the tribe for the food system and then enacts that. That's the role of a tribal government. And then there's so much here that can be done in this space. But also just talking to other tribal governments, thinking kind of in an intertribal way, and thinking of, and preparing for future challenges that may be very, very related. I think we're seeing right now with some of the water issues that are going on, tribes kind of joining together in that way and supporting one another through resolutions and that sort of thing. And that, again, is a role that's a thing that a tribal government can do that an individual can't necessarily do. So that this is a huge opportunity for tribal governments. And there are a lot more. Next slide, Brian. Thank you. So here are just some opportunities for tribes that through food and agriculture policies and codes, things that tribal governments can really do to make food sovereignty come alive and thrive in tribal communities. And these are just general principles. So, you know, establishing those robust protection of foods, and that's either traditional foods or foods that are just produced inside tribal jurisdiction that are going to be sold either inside or outside tribal jurisdiction. Protecting the land itself. The Standing on the Solution is a reference to Feeding Ourselves, which is a report that Janie, our director, authored with Crystal Echohawk and Wilson Pipestem. It's a very long but very excellent portrayal of kind of systemic oppression and the state of Indian country food and ag today, and some solutions for the future. And literally standing on the solution, the land itself. There are 57 million acres of land in Indian country, and the report really portrays that land itself as the solution to the health and economic challenges that are in Indian country today, because through recapturing food systems, it's possible to increase food security, to grow more food that's local, that stays at home, that's healthy, that people can access, and also to restart businesses and recapture the value of some of the food dollar that's actually leaving reservations right now. So that's part of this. That's an opportunity for a tribal government through laws like the ones that we're hoping to turn out in the next year with the Food and Ag Code project. Protecting culture is part and parcel of all of this, but it's also not the whole thing. Although I think it does kind of run through everything that we do. Again, that's a huge piece of food sovereignty, and never really losing sight of that is very important. But creating business opportunities, I think I've talked about a little bit more, making sure health is prioritized. I think a good example of a tribal government standing in that space is probably the Healthy Dinner Nation Act that the Navajo Nation passed several years ago. I think the popular title, I think, is the junk food tax. And actually thinking about a policy of helping people, really giving effect to healthy choices and working with local businesses creating funds through taxation that actually support the local Navajo farmers who are growing that food that's healthy and then getting it to people. That's a big thing that a tribal government can do. And so that's just one example, I think, of how this can actually work. And that is, you'll notice, not only just a health thing, right? That's also creating a business opportunity, because it says that the junk food is taxed, but then that tax fund is used to go in and create other opportunities for people to grow food and be able to do it locally. So that's a really cool legal tool that tribal governments are able to use to actually make food sovereignty come alive. And that's part of having a shared vision and thinking about and establishing a policy and really working with the power of the people, because that's how that law came about. It was a grassroots effort on the Navajo Nation. So those are just some examples of some opportunities for tribal governments. And those are the general examples. We'll turn to more specifics in the next few slides. So here's what could be included in a tribal food and agriculture code. And I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation that the code project is a 3-year project, and in our first year our team hasn't really been focused on writing code as much. We've been more researching, but more importantly we've really been dialoguing with tribal governments, with native farmers and ranchers and fishermen and tribally owned and native owned food businesses, and we've been talking to people at regional roundtables all over the country all about the things that they see as issues that a tribal food and agriculture code could actually help fix for them, things that they actually deal with in their day-to-day life, that if a tribe were occupying this space in the form of a law or a regulation, that would actually help them be more successful in their business or get more healthy food to their people, or what have you. So we've had over 20 regional roundtables all over the country, and we're not done with those. We'll keep doing them, but we're gonna greatly slow down on them just a little bit, because we're going to start writing very, very soon. But we have had 20 so far, and hopefully, I don't know if some of the people on the call are hearing this information again, because they've already been to one, and if so, thank you for listening to this again. But we really wanted to do these roundtables because we wanted to do the code. We wanted to do it in a good way. We wanted to make sure that we didn't just present a code that we had kind of written in our own little legal microcosm to people. We knew that we needed to have that kind of dialogue with people who would actually be interacting with the code and using it to further their business, to protect their traditional foods, et cetera, et cetera. So on the next few slides, and we can stay here for a second, Brian, you don't have to switch it yet, but you're going to see just a few examples, and I say few kind of jokingly because these are pretty full slides, of the feedback that we've gotten. These are potential sections that we will be writing many of in phase 2 of the project. So you'll see here, these are just a few. You'll see traditional food protection here, seeds and seed protection here. People have brought up a whole different, whole range of different things to these roundtables that have been really exciting. Protecting the environment obviously is a big topic on everybody's mind right now, and we've heard that in many, many places. But also protecting encouraging beginning farmers and ranchers, thinking through programs that could be established through the law that could help that next generation get the kind of knowledge and resources that they need to actually start businesses or start community gardens and get involved in food systems in a really robust way. We've heard a lot about beginning farmers and ranchers. That next generation's on a lot of people's minds. Biotechnology, so that's again a little bit more of the seed and seed protection area, actually protecting the seeds themselves. That's a big thing. You'll see taxation down there. We have talked about taxes. We've talked about taxing on healthy foods. We've talked about other kinds of taxes. So tax incentives actually for producers who are selling locally is a thing that's come up at a couple of roundtables. Those are all options of things that might be in a tribe's food and agriculture code. We can go to the next slide, I think, now. So here's more. I wasn't kidding. You'll see how diverse these topics are, and I mean that makes complete sense given how diverse Indian country is. The foods are different, the production methods and the growing seasons are different. So we know that this massive legal code that we produce is not going to have all sections be relevant to all tribes across the country. We totally understand that. But what we really want to do is offer a code that hits on as many things as possible so that tribal governments can choose what makes sense for them in light of the foods that they have, the production methods that most of their producers are using. And in that sense, this is really encouraging kind of a collaborative effort, right, between tribal governments and their producers, because again, we don't want to overburden producers. We want to make sure that they're protected through these laws. So here's a few more things. You'll see quite a few more on the next slide as well, I believe. This is our last potential section, but that doesn't mean that this is an exhaustive list. There are definitely more things. The thing that's nice and also a little bit scary about being a food and ag lawyer is that pretty much everything is related to agriculture and food in some way, shape, or form. So you'll see that we've covered tax law, property law, tort law. Any kind of law that you can think of is probably going to be in this code in some form or fashion. That's just the nature of food. It really touches everything that we do, and tribes already know that. But I wanted to give you a couple of very specific examples so we can look at those right quick. I wanted to lift up 2 examples of the code that we're actually going to be releasing this year. Our phase 2 of our project has just begun, and that's our big drafting phase. We're actually going to be hunkering down and doing quite a bit of writing, but we didn't want to do no writing in the first year. We wanted to produce a few preliminary code sections just so folks could see kind of where we were and what we were going to be doing with the rest of the project. And so the examples here are going to be preliminary code sections that we're going to release later this year. They'll also be included with the whole finished product that'll come out in 2015. And I do want to note that all of this will be available at no cost to folks. We exist at the initiative to be a resource for tribal governments and native farmers and ranchers and food producers and food businesses. And we have some amazing partners who allow us to do this work at no cost to the folks who need access to it. So I wanted to make sure I made that note before I dug into food safety a little bit more. So food safety is going to be a big piece, since that's kind of what spurred us on to do this project in the first place. We're definitely going to focus on food safety here in this first round of code writing that's actually going to be released. So tribal governments clearly have inherent authority to regulate for food safety protection. It goes directly to the health, safety, and welfare of all tribal citizens to make sure that food is safe. So we've got that federal law that I talked about, the Food Safety Modernization Act. That's the federal law that establishes these really broad standards for food regulation that FDA is slowly putting out rules on. We've seen a few come out. We'll have many more in the next year or so that FDA will be rolling out, and we'll be doing trainings on those periodically throughout the next year as well. So if you're curious about the Food Safety Modernization Act, if you're a producer of food business and you tuned in today and you're thinking about what that may mean for your business, we will be starting some trainings on those. So keep an eye on our website. We'll have more information about those. I think we've got the address on the very last slide. I wanted to mention that before I moved on. So as I said, liability on the farm we're moving more there, we're moving regulations more there, and state and local jurisdictions as well as the federal government are already kind of getting in on the regulatory game in terms of food safety. Now, tribal foods move across jurisdictions regularly. If you think about it, something that's grown in one particular place may cross 3 or 4 jurisdictional lines just on its way to its destination. So that's a bit of a puzzle sometimes for tribal producers as to what law applies and where and when. When tribal governments have adopted food codes for retail food establishments, a lot of that has come through the gaming enterprises. If people want to do business on the reservation, they'll pass a retail food establishment code, so that's already on the books, but it doesn't actually include in many cases, or really in most cases, any kind of on-farm food safety. And that's going to be really, really important to start including, because the federal system is moving in that direction, and that means that state and local jurisdictions are going to follow suit, even more so than they already have. So tribal governments can't. We don't want people to be left out of that piece, because that when tribal governments don't stand in this space, what it means is that other actors get to come in and they get to argue that they're rules may apply. So since we think that tribal governments are the best in the best position to protect tribal producers and tribal resources, that's sort of the whole reason behind the code. We want to make sure that we include those on-farm safety regulations just to make sure that we're protecting tribal producers from extra regulation by other actors, by federal, state, and local actors. And that's part of what we're doing with the code. So that's food safety, and that's going to be coming out here before the end of the year. We're going to have a food safety piece that we'll be releasing of the code. Part of what we want to do with this, we've had some really good suggestions in terms of format as we've been on the road at all the roundtables, and we want to put this out in kind of a workbook form, and that's going to help people sort of think through the particular issues that are most relevant to them and their tribe. We're also available always as a resource to talk through any kind of issues with these code sections that we're putting out. So if you see something, you have questions, once they're released, please contact our team. We are always available to help. We know that food safety in particular is very granular and very, very complex, and that can be kind of a hard nut to crack when you add in the many competing different kinds of jurisdictions on top of it. But that's what we're there for, to try to lessen the burden on tribal elected officials and tribal council and attorneys to actually draft those themselves. We're trying to make it easier by reading all of the food safety laws, harmonizing them where it makes sense with federal law, but also using that kind of as a floor and not a ceiling to let tribes do whatever they want to do in terms of crafting their own food safety regulations. And again, not to be overburdening of tribal producers, but because FDA is starting to dip its toe into this water, what we're already starting to see is that the market is already starting to absorb those regulations. So as the market shifts, even if there's not a law in the books, in order to access certain markets, producers may already need to be up to these standards. So that's part of the reason that we're writing this and also doing trainings in conjunction, just to make sure that this makes sense to everybody. So that is our first example. That's food safety. And I'm going to pause and take a drink of water really fast and ask for your feedback before I move on to the second example. We want to know what your food and agriculture needs are. If you haven't been able to come to one of those 20 roundtables that we had, we've tried to be around the whole country, but we know we haven't hit everybody just yet. If you are on the call today and you're thinking about something that you think might be useful to you, some kind of law that could be on your tribe's food and ag code that could help you as a producer, as a person who's trying to get increased access to healthy food that's local, anything to do with food and agriculture, and as you saw, it's a wide, wide world. Anything at all that you think might need to be included in this, that please go here to our SurveyMonkey. You can either type that in or you can scan that QR code. If you have a QR code reader on your smartphone, it'll take you right to our survey, and you can go ahead and tell us what your thoughts are and what you think you'd like to see in a model food and agriculture code. So we can let that stay up there for just a second. I'm going to take a drink of water. All right, we can come back to it too. So this is our second example, and this one's, a lot of this is kind of my baby, so I'll try not to get carried away and talk for half an hour just about food waste and food recovery. But liability protections for farmers in general are a thing that we've heard a lot across the country that folks would kind of like to have, and this is what I talk about when I talk about valuing food producers and really protecting them. These are liability, not total shields, but they're protections in the law. So actually, if somebody comes along and they want to sue a farmer for some particular reason, their states across the country, pretty much all states, have a law, for example, that protects farmers if they're sued on nuisance charges, and that means nuisance can, usually if people think about smells, they complain that your pigs smell bad or the chickens smell bad, and they want to sue the farmer that is on the land next door because they are irritated by the fact that that pigs smell. This is a very general explanation of what right to farm is, but there are actual laws on the books in states that prevent those kinds of suits or lessen those kinds of suits. So that's one less thing that a farmer has to worry about, which is good. When you're talking about risk management, Gary talked about risk management quite a bit and mentioned legal risk management, and that's part of it. You don't have to think about getting insurance for the odors of your farm because there are liability protections that actually keep you safe, and that's a good thing. That's just one less thing you can mark off your list that you don't have to have a bullet point for and figure out how to mitigate that risk. And the same kind of thing applies. There are laws that protect people who do agritourism. That is, I think the most common example that I usually give is people who do like corn mazes or pumpkin patches or something on their farm in the fall, and people come onto the farm and they do the maze and everything. Well, if you're doing that kind of thing, thinking about what happens if somebody comes on the farm for a reason like that and then they suffer an injury, that's another legal risk that you think about mitigating. And the law can actually come in and help with that if there's a law in the books that says, well, we're going to limit the amount that a farmer might be liable for something like that. So there are things that promote agritourism and actually help farmers in that regard as well. Those are laws that are on the books in states, and part of those have been things that have been suggested to us to actually include also in our Model Food and Agriculture Code. The piece that I've skipped here is the piece that I'm trying not to talk about too much because I know too much about it, and that's the food recovery and food waste or food recovery donation liability. So I think food waste has been a pretty popular topic in the last year or so, at least in the food and ag spaces that I follow. I think it's gotten a lot of attention. The amount of food that's wasted overall worldwide could actually pretty much cover the entirety of Russia. That's how much food is wasted every year, and most of that is safe and edible food that's just thrown away for one reason or another. And that happens pretty much everywhere. It's not a problem of a single place or country in the world. It's really a worldwide sort of issue, and that leads to a whole host of bad things, and that I won't necessarily go into. But one of the things that people try to do is waste less, but also take that food that's safe and make sure that it gets to people who need it. So food insecure families and persons, those are things that have been priorities in terms of food recovery. And food recovery just means taking that safe, edible food, getting it to usually a nonprofit like a food bank, and then the food bank takes it and makes sure it gets to a food insecure family. And all of that is done with food safety as an utmost priority. Nobody wants to make anybody sick in any of these kinds of places. But a lot of times when people are talking to businesses or restaurants about recovering that food, they're very, very hesitant to do so because they're afraid of legal liability. They're afraid of lawsuits, that if they donate that food and then somebody can say that they got sick from it and sue them, and they get a lawsuit and they get bad press for their business. So instead they just throw the food away. So to lessen that and actually encourage food recovery, in 1996, the U.S. Congress passed what's short form here called the Bill Emerson Act. The long name of it is the Bill Emerson Good Samaritan Food Donation Act, because lawyers like lots of words. And this law actually is a liability shield for people who have made good faith donations of food to charitable organizations that are making sure that food gets to food insecure families. Those don't really exist at the tribal level right now, so if it's all taking place within tribal jurisdiction, there may be a jurisdictional question as to whether or not the Bill Emerson Act actually applies in a tribal space. So part of what we're going to be producing in the food code is a similarly crafted liability shield that operates solely within tribal jurisdiction. It won't be a copy and paste from the federal law. There'll be a couple of differences, but we're just trying to make it most appropriate for tribes. So we'll have that as well in the code. That'll be another piece of that. And that's, next slide, I think. Yeah. So just to kind of wrap this up, or start wrapping this up, I know I've got a few more slides here. Just the the role of tribal governments, it's just the tribal government involvement in food policy and food and ag law is just so crucial to really bringing the principles of food sovereignty to life that we talked about at the very beginning of this presentation. If you think about that definition of food sovereignty again, just making sure that people are fed, valuing the people who are growing the food, protecting them, helping them make sure that they either stay in business or they're able to operate whatever kind of operation that they're working with to keep going, and making sure that food is available locally and the food is culturally appropriate food, making sure that you're working with nature and not against it, and just putting all of the control for that locally in the hands of the governments that are actually sitting over that particular local food system. All of that mouthful that I just repeated is exactly the role of a tribal government and a tribally elected official. It's because all that is just protecting the health, the safety, welfare, and the future generations of the tribe. So the role of tribal elected officials really is so key here in making sure that there's a foundation based in a shared vision and policy, and that isn't just a shared vision and policy necessarily of elected officials, but it's a holistic policy that thinks about all of the people in the tribe, the way that producers are growing food in a particular tribal community, the kinds of food that they're growing, what their vision is to continue that for the future and to make it even more robust so that everybody has an opportunity to get healthy, safe, local food. You think about assessing a community and looking for what your tribal food system might look like. Now, I think a good precursor to any kind of tribal food and ag law code passage is probably to do an assessment of a community food system. And First Nations Development Institute helpfully already has a thing that will help people do that. They have a food and ag sovereignty toolkit that you can go online and get for free. We have they're very, very in-depth. You get a lot of really good information, not just about the current state of the tribal food system, but also a lot of good stories and things that are in danger of being lost of the creation of that tribal food system and what it looked like pre-contact. So those can be really, really very interesting. We've got a couple of students actually right now who come through our summer program who are doing that for their tribes. And if anybody's interested in hearing about how they stood those up, I'd be happy to make connections for you. They're really passionate, energetic youth, and they're very excited to be looking at what their food systems look like now and then helping their tribal governments craft a vision for the future that maybe gets back to some of those pre-contact ways, but also incorporates new developments in their food system as well. More roles of tribal governments, just possible things that could happen, not necessarily going to be appropriate in every case, but some people have created food and ag departments actually that help think through this policy. That's another option. That's another thing that could be created through a tribal code. Just regulating any kind of food production in a way that makes sense and isn't overburdensome but still manages to be protecting. And of course, finally, encouraging youth as the future generation that's going to lead the tribe in food and ag. Really can't occur without tribal government's involvement. It's so crucial. And so part of what we're trying to do with the food code is really make that work easier, kind of lay the groundwork and let people then take what we've written and make it relevant to them and their experience and to affect their shared vision and policy. I think before I close, I've got some data because everybody on our team is a total data nerd, as Jamie likes to say, and so I've got just a few slides that are kind of, when we talk about Indian country ag and protecting local food systems, I always like to lift up some of the data that we know about native food systems just to give people kind of a general idea of what we already know and what's out there to be protected and to make more robust. So this is a slide from our last National Census of Agriculture that happens every 5 years. It's conducted by the USDA through the National Agriculture Statistics Service, which is another mouthful. This is from the last one that happened in 2012, and we know that the native producer numbers are very underreported in this, but this is just a snapshot of the folks who did report in. It's self-reporting, so people don't come to your door. You fill out a survey and then your data goes into the whole national system. One dot, every tiny blue dot that you see on there is 10 farms that are operated by an American Indian or Alaska Native operator. And if you kind of switch back and forth between this map and the next map, which is a map of food deserts in Indian country, you can see a lot of the places with native producers are also places that are food deserts. So the food that's grown there, probably by an American Indian or Alaska Native producer, is then leaving the tribe's jurisdiction. So the value of that food dollar doesn't stay with the tribe. And part of what we want to make it easier for people to do with the Food and Ag Code is to rethink food policy through a Food and Ag Code. And actually shape it so that that is happening less, so that the value of the food dollar is captured more and more by the tribe, by tribal food producers, and so that the access to food increases in the community. That was one of the suggestions that we got at our very first roundtable, was using these kinds of Food and Ag codes, using laws to incentivize local food sales and rethink how we help support tribal producers so that they are recapturing the economic value of their food dollar and keeping it local. The next one, we talked a lot about beginning farmers and ranchers. We always like to show folks where those folks are. This is a map of Native FFA students. There are more than 200 chapters across the United States that have FFA students in them who are Native. This is actually a map from 2011. There's a newer one that just came out that we need to put in here too. It's from 2015, and the number has gone up from 12,000 to 15,000. So there are at least 15,000 Native youth in FFA all across the country. So Native youth are out there, they're interested in food and ag, they're interested in being part of their tribal food system, and using the law to make sure that we're really supporting those folks, I think is pretty crucial, and we've heard that in pretty much every location that we've gone for a roundtable. The next bit is, the next couple of slides are really all about, it's more from the Ag Census, and this is about the value of the commodities that are currently produced by American Indian or Alaska Native food producers, and this is what we know. This, you can see cattle and calves and poultry and eggs kind of battle it out for the very top slots, and followed immediately by grains. That's what's produced in Indian country now. And then if you look at the next one, I think it actually breaks that down. It gives you some totals. Yeah, so there's a $3 billion annual market value, evenly, sort of evenly divided between livestock and then everything else. That's the value of just the raw commodities. The Intertribal Agriculture Council has run some of the numbers, and I think the last estimate I saw was that with changes, both legal changes and policy changes in Indian country, that $3 billion could be turned into $9 billion if we just make some policy shifts that allow food producers, native food producers, to actually keep capturing more and more of the value of that food dollar. So that's why we always point this out. It's just to say there's a lot being done, but with just a little bit of change in terms of policy and the law, that can actually become even better. So just a little bit of data about food and ag in Indian country right now. Before I wrap up and take any questions that there may be out there, I want to make sure that I take some time to give a huge thank you to all of our sponsors who make our work possible. To the Shakopee, Midwakan, and Sioux community, to Mazan, a Jewish Response to Hunger, Agua Fund, Inc., and the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, as well as Farm Credit. We would not be able to do this work without them. We are so thankful that they've been continually supporting our work. So thank you very much to all those folks. If you have any questions or thoughts about us or want to keep up with the work that we're doing, you can always go to our website, indigenousfoodandag.com. You can also find a little bit more on our law school's website, that separate web address. That's the second one there, law.uark.edu/IFI. Or you can find us on social media. We're on Facebook. You can also find us on Twitter, I believe on Instagram as well. But you can get all those links from our website, indigenousfoodandag.com. And then finally, if you have any particular questions for anybody on our team, this is our main team. This is who we are. We've got all of our email addresses up there. Yeah. On that second one right there, you can reach me at echeryl@uark.edu. And the rest of our team is also listed there. Those are our consulting attorneys, our director, Janie, Brian, our director of tribal relations, who's running this webinar today, as well as some of our office staff. Anybody who's listed there is able, ready and willing to talk to you about food and ag issues in Indian country. So please reach out if you have any questions at all. If you have any thoughts about the food code project, I would love to hear from you, and so would Janie. Please don't hesitate. Don't be a stranger. So I think that is everything that I had. If we've got any questions, either for me or for Gary, I think we can take them now.
All right, thank you, Erin. I'll just remind everyone that if you have a question, you can raise your hand or you can type it into the questions box, and we'll take your question. And I've got one here. Let's see. We have a question, but for some reason, Roberta, I'm not able to, it's not giving me an option to unmute you. So it might be something on your end, but if you type your question into the questions box, then I'll go ahead and read it. All right, thank you. Oh, this question is to Erin. She's wondering if you're enrolled.
I am not. Everyone on our staff is. So just me who's not.
Janie is, just so you know about the initiative, Janie is enrolled Chickasaw. Tony is a member of the Colville tribe in Washington. I believe Ade is Cochiti Pueblo.
Cochiti and Kiowa, yes.
Okay. And then Dave, I believe, is Navajo.
Yes.
I'm enrolled Cherokee. Emerald is of Hoopa descent, and Michelle is Seneca Cayuga.
Yes.
All right. Do we have any other questions about the code project? Oh, wait. Roberta typed in, she was just wondering because you're doing an awesome job.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Roberta. I really appreciate that.
And I'm sorry that I'm not able to unmute you, Roberta, so you can speak for yourself, but it's just not allowing me to do that, so I'm not sure what's going on.
Thank you for putting up with our technical difficulties, Roberta. We really appreciate it.
Any other questions? Okay, with no other questions, then we will go ahead and close out our webinar for today. I'd like to thank Gary Madison for his presentation on making money while reaching your goals. We very much appreciate his time with that presentation. And then I'd also like to thank Erin for a presentation on the Model Food Code project. I'll remind everyone on our call today that if you go to our website at indigenousfoodandag.com, there you can find not only all of the profit webinars that we've done in the past, you'll also be able to find today's webinar, and you'll be able to find information on the Model Food Code project. So everything that has been discussed today will be available on our website, and so I would encourage you to visit it. And with that, I will go ahead and end today's webinar. Thank you for attending.